I'm sorry, but this is an absolute attack, and it's an attack on females' rights.
Well, it certainly is, not just on females' rights, but certainly that's a very important part of it. Kate Barker's here. She's the CEO of the LGB Alliance. Let's find out what she makes of it. Kate, very good morning to you.
Morning.
Thanks for talking to us. Two versions of this story in the papers today, really. The Mail's got biological sex erased from official data, which seems to be entirely wrong. And then the Telegraph's got the fact that criminals are free to pick their own gender because the government is refusing to force police to record biological sex. And even now, even after having all this pointed out to them, the government is still going to stick to their guns, I think.
It seems crazy, doesn't it? I mean, the point of a court case surely is truth, finding the truth. So if you're going to kick off proceedings with an obvious lie,
right,
it seems absolutely an absurd way to start. And it does contribute to the degradation of data that we see across all of our institutions. So it is across, the court, it's across the NHS, and it has some real world consequences. For example, to sort of think one of these things through. If you were a man and you were in court accused of sexually assaulting a child, and you said, "Well, I want to be recorded as a woman,"
yeah,
and that went into official statistics, in a few years we'd look at the data and say, "Oh, look, men are no more likely to offend than women." And predators would use that to say, "Well, look, it's clearly that men and women offend at the same rate, so there should be no limits on men sleeping with groups of girls on a Girl Guides trip or on a kids club camping trip." So it's a kind of a smoke screen that predators use to hide behind in order to be predatory. So it's got real world consequences. And for us, the erasure of the reality of sex with this kind of magical ectoplasm of gender has a lot of impacts on lesbians, gay men and bisexuals. It's a really huge deal. Because what we see is horrible predatory men who like to claim that they are lesbians being emboldened to do so and to force themselves into lesbian social groups and lesbian support groups, because the notion that feeling like something supersedes the biological reality of actually being something is being supported and endorsed by decisions like today and by what's happening in the courts.
It's a kind of insanity, really, isn't it? I mean, it's asking people to believe something which is demonstrably not true.
Yes, and it's quite difficult to unpick exactly why it's proved so sticky. And it seems to me that there are a lot of people, particularly men, to be honest, who are not terribly affected by all of this, who think, look, where's the harm? What does it matter? If a man wants to call himself she, then why can't we all just be nice and go along with it? Because they're not at the sharp end of what's happening. They're unlikely to find themselves as a woman in a prison cell with a man.
Yeah.
But the consequences aren't just in the courts. As I say, they're in the NHS as well. And what we're seeing is people are missing really important appointments because they've decided to report that they are the opposite gender. So they're not getting called forward for a smear test or for a prostate exam. And people are falling ill as a consequence. So I think this general degradation, this acceptance that fantasy, that the way you feel, that something that's in your head is more important than biological reality and truth, is a really, really difficult one to unpick. And it's interesting that this report that's come out today, so it's the Sullivan report on data and statistics, was actually commissioned by the last government. So it will be very interesting to see as this government inches towards the realisation that sex and gender must be disaggregated, how they respond to that and what their reaction to that is going to be.
Well, this is the thing. It looks as though at the moment, anyway, they're not prepared to change what the status quo is. They don't seem to be prepared to order the data be collected in a different way. And it's affecting the police, it's affecting the NHS, it's affecting all manner of civil service departments as well. And you wonder where this kind of stuff comes from. I mean, who would have ordered that this would be done?
Well, we see that in the report it shows that it was about in 1990 when things started to go south a bit. And up until that point, sex and gender were really used interchangeably. And most of us, when we said gender, really we meant sex. Right. But that lack of clarity, some some people use that as an opportunity to push forward an agenda which suited them. And the confusion that's arisen now is absolutely endemic, and it's running through all of our institutions. The recommendations on this report are really good and really sensible, and they say we must always record sex in every instance, and if you want to also record somebody's gender identity, whether they think they're non-binary or gender fluid or whatever, that's absolutely fine as well, because it is useful to keep statistics on trans identities and identities which
as long as it's additional,
that's fine. But you must. But sex must be the measure, and sex must be collected in all things. So it'd be hard to understand if the government doesn't do this.
Yes.
Why? There's no downside for anybody.
No, exactly. And I mean, we get the impression sometimes from looking around us and seeing what sort of adverts are changing, and the fact that many private sector companies, rather, I should say, are kind of slightly rowing back on a lot of this, DEI type policy. There's no evidence that that's happening in the public sector. The public sector seems to be as bad as it ever was.
A lot of people, it's their job. They've trained for it for a long time. They make a lot of money out of it, whether they're a consultant or whether they're embedded actually within an institution. So they're an EDI professional, they're a diversity and inclusion or HR, and their mortgage depends on it, really. So it's going to be fairly difficult to weed it out. But I think there has to be an intent shown from the top, a recognition that sex is important in almost every case. And two things can be true. It can be true that sex is important, but it's also to look at people with trans identities and different kinds of identities and measure them too. But those two things should run in parallel. One must not, that gender, which is an idea about how you feel about yourself in your head, can never be more important than the biological reality that we all live with.
No, sure. And I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day. It was a psychiatrist who does some work with sort of trans offenders, if you like. And an awful lot of them, as she was saying, are actually in, shall we say, prisons that they shouldn't be in for a deliberate reason, that they want to be there, that they want to be amongst women because they're predators.
If you gave people the opportunity, I mean, Mike, if you were accused of a horrible crime, a horrible sex crime, which I'm sure will never happen, and you were able to simply say, and you knew you were facing a long stretch, you were able to simply say, I'm a woman, and then you'd go into a women's prison, which is you'd be much less likely to be attacked, the conditions are better, they're much smaller, there's more opportunities for education. The question isn't, would you do it? The question is, why wouldn't you? Yeah. There's every incentive there to do it. So I know we've seen statistics which show that a really high proportion of trans-identifying males in prisons are sex offenders. Yeah. And you have to ask yourself, does being trans make you more likely to be a sex offender? I think that's unlikely. Or are men gaming the system in order to advantage themselves? Now, one of those two things is true. I don't think the first one is true. Yeah. I think the second one seems much more likely. So giving people the opportunity to game the system, given that they're already criminals, it's really hard to understand why anybody would choose to do that and why the government wants to perpetuate it, particularly as it's enormously unpopular within the electorate. I don't know if you saw the recent YouGov poll, which was changing attitudes to trans-identified people, or trans rules, I suppose. And it showed that the vast majority of people across every demographic don't want to see men in women's toilets. They don't want to see men in women's prison and men in women's sports. And it's an absolutely reasonable mainstream point of view. The government needs to get on board with that and recognise that sensible people who do care about other people and their identities and don't want to see anybody disadvantaged, but they want to see women's rights and gay rights protected as is proper.
Yes, of course. And why, just one final thing, why do you think judges are so keen to kind of go along with this type of thing? I
think it's because they're drawn from a particular demographic who are unlikely to have been disadvantaged by this in the past. But I also think they're lagging behind the evidence. And actually, there's a Supreme Court case coming up where LGB Alliance is an intervener in that, where the meaning of the difference between sex and gender is really going to be tested. And I think there'll be, if that's successful, I think there'll be huge changes across the judiciary to the benefit of all.
Yeah, let's hope so. Kate, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Kate Parker, the CEO of the LGB Alliance.